Well, welcome to the Encounter Faith podcast. My name is Ross, and I have the privilege of hosting these conversations. And throughout this series at Good Shepherd that we've called Be the One, we're talking to a variety of our folks here at Good Shepherd about their individual perspectives and sharing a lot of wisdom around child discipleship. I love leaning into a conversation like this because it is one of the most important conversations we can have. And for most of us, a conversation we're not having nearly enough. So today I get to sit with Pastor Tara Beth. Pastor Tara Beth, it is always delightful to see you.
It is always delightful to be on this podcast.
And actually, that means something coming from you because you're on every other podcast. A lot of people don't know that.
But this one's my favorite.
I want to jump in because one of the things that has stood out to me about the opportunity here, especially for a church like ours, is we get to lean into folks like you and Jeff, your husband, who have walked the walk. I'm thinking about parents in my stage of life who are looking at parents in your stage of life going like, oh, they know how some of this is going to go.
Yeah.
So I want to just ask a broad question as we jump in. The ways in which you and Jeff have approached discipleship of your boys. One of the things I'm curious about for you as a pastor is how you navigate knowing the things you're supposed to do and living that out. So I don't know, to ask that in as broad a way as I can, how do you guys even talk about this within your home?
Yeah. So for us, when it comes to discipleship, so much of it flows out of everyday, ordinary life.
Sure.
So it's woven into our very ordinary conversations about school or friendship dynamics or prayer time. So every morning before the boys leave for school, I take them by the shoulder and I look them in the eye and I say, what is the most important thing for you to do today? And what they're supposed to say is love God with all of my heart, love my neighbor as myself, and do my absolute best. And I am a child of God. I have a teenager that's in high school now. And what he usually says is love God, love my neighbor, try my hardest, and I'm a child of God. But when he says it, he has that little like half smile where he's trying to pretend like he doesn't really like this ritual that we have, this routine that we have. And he wants to pretend like he's rolling his eyes. But I know that boy, and I know as a mama that those daily reminders for him that his chief role as a student in his school is to love God with everything, to love his neighbor and do his absolute best, and to remember whose he is, that he is a child of God. And our discipleship can be wrapped up into those statements right there. Because one of the things that we do is when something happens is we'll say, boys, why do we say every single morning the importance of loving God and loving your neighbor? I don't know. Well, okay, let's unpack it a little bit. They don't really talk, but they are teenagers. Any parent of a teenager can understand to that, that reaction.
No, I'm laughing at how uncanny your brain was of me when I was a teenager.
There you go. There you go. Yeah. And so then we can say, okay, well, in this situation that you're going through with this friend at school, let's talk about what does it mean to love them, to love your neighbor as yourself in this context? What does it mean to love your teacher as yourself? What does it mean to love God in your school? And so much of our discipleship is wrapped around the greatest commandment when Jesus says, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord your God, the Lord is one." And what's it say? Love the Lord your God with all of your heart, with all of your soul, with all of your mind. And that's where that try your hardest comes from. Like we just want our boys to give it their all, and all of your strength. Give it your all for the glory of God. And the second is this: love your neighbor as yourself. There is no other commandment greater than these. And, and that commandment begins with, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one." And it says, "The Lord our God," which means that we are God's children.
Yeah.
And so that is discipleship for us. It isn't memorizing curriculum. We definitely go through phases where we will go through a family devotional at dinner, at night. Our family meal times are so central to how we do discipleship in our home.
Right. Oh man. Okay. So there's a couple things there that I want to lean into a little bit. You talk about this core ritual that you guys have,
Mm-hmm.
and I love that and am stealing it already. But zooming out, I remember engaging in conversations like these, and one of the main barriers that people feel is that they feel like they don't have time.
Mm-hmm.
And what I love about what you just talked about there is you aren't adding time,
Mm-mm.
using the time you are given
Mm-hmm.
to lean into discipleship.
That's right.
And then the other thing that just to highlight is you talk about this key moment that you have with your boys before school starts. And that
Yeah.
feels like a very intentional prayer over your boys.
Yeah.
But then you
Yeah.
talk about family.
Yeah, and I didn't even mention that part. After we do that, Jeff and I lay hands on the boys and pray for them. Before every single morning, we lay hands on them and we pray for them before they walk out that door.
That's beautiful. Because then, but when you're having dinner together or whatever
Mm-hmm.
the family meal is that particular day, it I imagine is more casual, is more recapping the day. There's
Yep.
more laughs in those moments.
Yep. Yep.
And I think so many folks start with this misconception around child discipleship of, oh, I have to sit in a dusty chair and open up a dusty Bible and use King James translations
Mm-hmm.
in order for discipleship to count.
Right.
And you provide this spectrum of examples that show that that doesn't.
And then there's so much shame and guilt around that. You know,
Right.
parents feel so guilty that, oh, I should be reading 3 chapters of the Bible to my children every single morning before they go to school.
Yeah.
Well, actually, it doesn't have to be so rote.
Yeah.
If you think about the ways that Jesus did discipleship, he was walking along the road and notices a grapevine. And he turns to the disciples and he points to this grapevine. And he says, I am the vine and you are the branch.
Mm-hmm.
Abide in me. Like it was ordinary moments that Jesus chose to disciple his disciples.
Yeah. Where did the idea of this being extra or this sort of, I remember hearing John Mark Comer once talk about how we in American church have started treating discipleship, generally adult, kid,
Mm-hmm.
everywhere in between, mm-hmm. as this extra level of Christianity.
That's right.
And a core commandment from who Jesus is.
Yeah.
When you, in your experience as a pastor, I'm curious how that looks to unlock that for people.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because the experience I've had is going like, oh, wait, that one conversation I had in the car, that was the thing. That was discipleship.
Right. That was that's exactly it. Yeah. You know, I think I was a 1990s youth group Christian kid. And when I started to learn that as a Christian that I ought to engage in discipleship, that I ought to be a disciple, and well, everything about discipleship was all about cognitive propositions, if you will, or cognitive information that we take in, that we learn, that we memorize. And, you know, there is so much about that is important. That's why at Good Shepherd Church that we do have catechism. You know, we want to invite young people to learn the Apostles' Creed, the Lord's Prayer, how the Bible is put together. And there is so much that is so good for us to learn. You know, and so there's that. And then, well, we've got to pray and we've got to find the quiet space to do that. And what that ends up becoming is it is a to-do list. It is an add-on. Instead of viewing discipleship as a way of life, you know, a lot of spiritual formation experts will talk about discipleship like that trellis. Like if you think of a garden trellis. So right now we have a garden, and you've seen our garden, Ross. We're growing kale, and we have tomatoes out there. We have lots of goodness out there, and the tomatoes require that metal trellis for the vine to support it so it can grow. What is it that grows the tomatoes? Well, it's the sunshine and it is the water. The trellis is simply there as a support. And so when you think about some of these extra disciplines that are really good for us to incorporate in the Christian life and in discipleship, we want to think of it more as a support rather than a to-do list.
Yeah.
And then it becomes more of a way of life. And so when it comes to even discipling our children, teaching them that those supports exist in their everyday, ordinary lives and not just a prayer closet
Mhm.
is where I believe that children really learn how to walk in the way of Jesus.
Yeah. And the other thing that that does is it reorients the priority of
Right.
discipleship happening in the home and parents being the primary discipleship influence over their kids.
That's right.
Because we have done this thing, my friends at Awana love to talk about this. We have done this, we've made this critical error as Americans mostly by
Hmm.
trying to outsource our discipleship to the experts in the church
Hmm.
the way that
Right.
we outsource soccer practice.
Right.
And by highlighting the ways in which this is support, by highlighting the ways in which this is accessible, my
Yep.
hope is that folks go, oh, that is a thing that I can do because it's the way
Right.
that I'm parenting. It's the way that I'm living
Right.
my life.
That's right.
And we have this gap where I'm sure my friends that want to have more updated numbers, but back when I was there, it was something like 80%, or excuse me, something like 90% of church leaders recognize that parents are the primary discipler, but that
Hmm.
number is actually barely a majority for parents. So how do
Yep.
you close that gap? Because
Yeah.
parents, this is a whole separate podcast, but most parents who are engaged in this are recognizing a discipleship gap within themselves. They
Yeah.
themselves were discipled. So how do I disciple my
Yeah.
kids?
Yeah.
What I'm curious about with all that data for the nerds who are listening
Yeah.
is there you have talked to parents who are having that moment. The sort of
Oh, yeah.
cliche is, yeah,
And
go ahead.
often they're so intimidated.
Yeah.
They're so overwhelmed. They're so intimidated. Their kids are asking questions that they don't feel equipped for. And that's where I think the church can come in.
Right.
And that's why I'm so passionate about the Sunday morning gathering, about being in a community. This last Sunday, Ross, you talked about your small group,
Right.
how on Sunday afternoons you gather and you digest and debrief the sermon or something that you guys are reading. And on that life on life experience, um, you are being discipled. You are discipling one another. You are being fed, which is going to directly impact even how you disciple your children. And oh, by the way, your children are watching
Mhm.
you um, do church together,
Mhm.
watching you lean in to discipleship together in this small group community. And so, yes, it feels daunting, but we don't have to do it alone. There's a lot of parents out there that are trying to figure this out, and I'm on the phone with parents all the time, um, where I'm seeking help
Right.
on how to navigate an issue, on how to think about something.
And I'm curious, exactly, because this is one of those things that I feel like folks often just didn't have the words for.
Yeah,
There was this sense of, to your point, discipleship was talked about as this cognitive thing, but it's a more
right,
lived behavior, more of a way of life.
right.
So as a result, we have to provide words and education and
Yeah,
a structure, a framework. That's
yes,
the word I'm looking for
yeah,
folks. You have been able to, in your seat, you wind up having a lot of these conversations with parents. And I would imagine it influences how you and Jeff parent, how you and Jeff disciple, probably fairly often.
yeah.
There's a lot of folks who are listening who are hearing this conversation and going, okay, yeah, but how? Or yeah,
Hmm.
but soccer practice, or whatever the
Hmm.
barriers are that we put up in our lives and all
Yeah,
areas of our life.
yeah,
How do you begin to take this thing that's delivered to you as something that's cognitive and begin to live it out as a behavior within your home?
yeah. Yeah, I think it begins with having those conversations, those family conversations, talking about it. Um, it doesn't have to be this big, scary, we're going to have a family meeting and boy, we're going to start discipleship in this home. And here's how we're going to do it. And here's the new structure. And oftentimes with families like this kind of thing does happen, especially like around New Year's Eve, the parents will sit the kids down and New Year's Eve, this next year, we are going to read the Bible 7 times together as a family, and we're going to do it for 1 hour every night after dinner time, and it fizzles out pretty quickly.
Mhm.
What I want to say is, first of all, like those families that do that, wow, like I like am in awe of
Yeah.
you.
Yeah.
That's incredible stamina. But what I want to say is To the parents who are saying, okay, yeah, so I'm the primary discipleship influence in my home. Start small, little things. Pray with your child before bed, on your way home from church. Have questions that you can ask your kid about what they learned about or the sermon. Pick a Bible verse, one Bible verse, and memorize it as a family, and then start to weave it into your everyday conversations like we do with the greatest commandment. Pick something that just becomes really core, maybe a Bible verse of the month.
Mm.
I have a friend who every single morning on their way to school, they would unpack a fruit of the Spirit. And
Oh,
so while she was driving to school, because she recognized that that car time was, she had their undivided attention.
right.
And so they would unpack the fruit of the Spirit, talk about what it looks like in everyday life, and then she would pray that fruit of the Spirit over them before the kids would get out of the car. And that's not a huge task,
No.
because then when the kids get home from school, you can say, so how did patience show up today? Where was it hard to show patience in your classroom? And where did you feel God help you show patience?
Yeah.
It's that, just start really small. It doesn't have to be scary. It doesn't have to be overwhelming.
Mm-hmm. And then you wind up not having, like you mentioned this earlier, the shame associated with it when it
Right.
inevitably fizzles out because
Right.
a sickness goes through your house. And if your house is anything like my house, when one person gets sick, you wind up just going, well, might as well cancel the next month worth of events because this
Yep.
virus is going to take down all of us.
Yes.
And if you are able to start small and able to start in a more of a sustainable mindset, then you are not having those moments of, well, this didn't work.
That's right.
Because everything, I remember seeing once somebody talk about this as a discipleship crisis. And I didn't love that frame, but I understood why they were saying that. But the benefit of it, if you yourself don't feel like you've been discipled, or you yourself feel like you are not actively discipling your kids, anything you do is a step in the right direction.
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
And that opportunity needs to be in your bones because it's one of the most important things. Because, people talk about this a lot. And you wind up talking about this for those of us who are following along in for sermons at Good Shepherd. You talk about this on last Sunday, which was this idea of how isolated today's world is, and how kids especially are growing up in a very isolated context. You and I have had conversations about my own kids in this way. One of the curiosities I have is the ways in which we meet kids where they're at. So thinking about you being a 90s youth group kid, to leading a youth ministry here in a previous life, to parenting your own boys. I'm curious how you've seen this trend towards isolation play out, because parents today are looking at their kids like they're from a different planet. And that's because they are.
They literally are. I need a translator with me half the time with just, I can't even keep up.
Skibbity is set in your home.
Skibbity. Skibbity Toilet, Ohio. It's just the things that I hear in my home. I'm like, come again. Does that mean cool? But wow, things are rapidly changing with teenagers. Okay, so let's think about, those 3 different chapters in my life that you just lifted up. 1990s Christian. How did we get a hold of each other? A landline phone and eventually a pager. Okay, but you still, if you were out, you had to find a landline phone to get a hold of someone in a pager. Then they had to go find a landline phone to call you back. And you had to sit by that landline phone until they actually called you back. Okay. And so miraculously, we found ways to still hang out all the time. And I just think about those days, we hung out without screens in front of our faces. And, and information spread slower, of course, because it was word of mouth, literally, and then let's go into when I was a youth pastor in the early 2000s. So let's say I was a youth pastor in total in youth ministry from 2003 until 2014.
Okay.
And I even watched just massive change, in 2003, cell phones were becoming somewhat common for teenagers, but they were flip phones. I will never forget in about 2008 when texting really started to become a thing. And then I as a youth pastor had to navigate all these new things that, whoa, students are texting me and they're texting a lot, and how do I navigate this?
Sure.
And so now, with the introduction of social media today, you and I just opened up a stat and I said to you, okay, so the statistic right here is 61% of teenagers in a study in 2021 from Pew Research noted that 61% of teenagers feel isolated and lonely all the time, all the time. But yet, aren't they more connected than ever
Right.
digitally? Information is able to spread faster. And I think there's so many things that have into play with this. We know COVID-19 had a significant impact on kids because it drove them deeper into their screens, deeper into social media, and then learning how to come out of that with such an addictive device in front of you was very difficult. And so many young people are stuck in kind of this cul-de-sac
Yeah.
of isolation and despair and loneliness. And this is where I believe so passionately, perhaps even more than ever now as a mom of a teenager, I really believe in the work of student ministries. At Good Shepherd, we have a middle school minister, we have a high school minister, and the work that they do in gathering kids and getting them out of their devices and creating community is absolutely critical for the discipleship and development of a young person today. Because, we've talked about Kurt Thompson a number of times on this podcast. I believe I've lifted his name up, but he talks about the actual healing power of being known in community. That trauma and wounds and pain and even the feeling of isolation and loneliness can actually be healed when you're in a loving and safe community that knows you and says, yeah, we know all these things about you, and you're still safe with us, and
Mm.
you're still stuck with us, and we still love you,
Yeah.
and we still think you're amazing. That is so critical for the development of a young person.
Yeah. Oh man. I remember hearing Andy Crouch talk once about how I don't even think it was him. I think it was just him telling a story. And Andy Crouch is such a nice person that I feel bad misquoting him. But the essence of the story was he was asking a group of teens about snap streaks. And for those of you who are listening,
Oh, yeah.
it is Snapchat, the social media platforms offer a sort of incentive, and they certainly mark if you're snapping back between friends each and every day.
Mm-hmm.
I felt 100 years old just explaining that, but that's a different issue. So he asks this question: how many of you engage in, how many of you have snap streaks with your best friend? And every hand goes up to this group of teens. And then he goes, how many of you wish you could stop? And
wow,
every hand stays up. And that's the other message to me in this isolation conversation is for
that
parents
blows my mind
and leaders to recognize this actually isn't a fair fight for you on your own.
That's right.
You aren't the screens, technology companies. These devices are set up to beat back what you are trying to instill in the life of your kids.
Mm-hmm.
And as a result, you have to lean into community. You have to lean into those who have gone before you, because otherwise you won't have the tools. I won't have the tools. No parent will have the tools to be able to navigate this by themselves, because the world is simply changing too quickly. The other thing, though, that I think is also important to hammer home here is our kids are growing up in the internet in a way that, for every parent listening, you either navigated to this space or you immigrated to this space, depending on when you were born.
Yeah.
But it doesn't matter if you're in the Bible Belt. It doesn't matter if you're in the most progressive city in the world. Our kids are growing up in a context that is not built around the church the way that maybe
and it's built around social media. It's built around. I mean, think about it. Like as you said, we migrated into this world of social media. Our kids, their minds are being formed
Yeah.
because of the world of social media, being like impacting their development. And that's terrifying.
Yeah. The hope, though, here, right, is I think about, I don't even remember the context where my wife Laura and I picked this phrase up, but it was each kid, each year.
Mm.
And it's this very basic idea of don't try to create a parenting habit, because when you're in my stage of life, they change every 6 months. As soon as you
Oh,
figure
yeah.
out the kid,
Yes.
a
Oh,
new kid pops out.
that's so good.
But
Love
also,
that phrase
yeah, but also by the
and
time
wisdom.
they're older, you are navigating a system where a lot of baggage that us adults are carrying is because, for even the best intention, we were parented in a way that was not each kid each year.
Right.
Not paying attention to the ways that these kids are unique, or paying attention to the way that even in your own home, those differences can become really big. And when I think about it in this conversation around discipleship, it leans into the need to have kids understand the need for community.
Yep, that's right.
And the need for this to exist.
Yeah.
You've mentioned earlier, the easiest way we can do that as parents is just live it out ourselves.
Right. Yeah.
But how do we navigate that for folks who understand it, but are currently feeling ill-equipped to, for lack of a better term, get their kids out of the world of a screen?
Yeah. 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 It's not easy. And, thankfully, there are controls, that you can actually just shut off screen time. And it's amazing. Whenever my boys actually are grounded from their devices, they almost seem relieved.
Yeah.
And so, incorporating like screen breaks is huge, huge. It's like you said, how many of those kids wanted to not have to do these snap streaks?
Yeah.
Like, I think there's a relief that happens. But also, again, like back to what you're doing in small group community, Ross, like you are modeling to your children what it looks like to not live in isolation. Your kids are watching mom and dad be incredibly filled with joy and laughter and fun when they are sitting in that circle. And those are tools for their tool belt later in life, that they are taking cues that, oh, when I'm in community, there's laughter and there's joy and there's fun. And so modeling that for our kids, and then also cultivating spaces for them to experience that themselves. I would imagine that at your small group time, there's times where you have millions of little kids just running everywhere, chasing each other around. Modeling that and also cultivating those kinds of spaces is so key.
Yeah. And I would hope it's a broader conversation, but what I would hope people hear in that is, one, just the importance of doing the thing, right?
Yeah.
If you're going to tell your kid to get off their device, you can't have your device on your person 24/7.
Yeah. Yeah.
But also that it's actually not to where we started this conversation. It's actually way more accessible than most of us give it credit for.
Yeah.
When I'm sitting in that small group, the biggest benefit for me is that I'm sitting across the table from another young dad who I don't have to apologize for being late or looking like I currently look.
Right.
Because there's that sense of belonging. There's that sense to the Kurt Thompson quote of being known.
Yeah.
Where I think we can begin to kind of wrap up here is when you are seeing your boys cultivate those rhythms within themselves. How do you and Jeff try to foster those things without it becoming this pressure cooker and sort of making it like, well, now I don't want to do it just because my mom and dad told me I had to?
Yeah. No, and you can't. We've learned with teenage boys that they have to want something for their lives. That if it's, if they're doing something because they're afraid they're going to get in trouble or they're going to lose something, then we are teaching our children to approach their faith out of guilt and ought. But we want them to approach their faith out of love. And so this is really tricky for me as a pastor because I don't ever want the boys to be bitter at the church for the church just taking over their mom or taking over, or for them to feel, because, and also like as church kids, like our kids, you have church kids, like they're being watched. Isaac, we joke, he's a mascot and the church is going to watch him develop and grow up. And that can be really hard, and that can be a lot of pressure as our children grow up. And so how do we then model for our children to want it, to desire it, that God is a God that desires to be with them? Others like John Mark Comer has described it as the unforced rhythms of grace.
Yeah.
And that's why for us, discipleship has been so much about all this. We have to do this time. Now, everybody put your hands on your lap, and I'm going to open this book, and we're all going to take turns reading for the next hour. But no, it's fun. It's everyday, ordinary moments. And then my prayer and my hope is in those moments, when we are praying for them, when we are laying hands on them, when we are reminding them whose they are as a child of God, that those things will be so deeply etched in their memory and their being, that when they are 28 years old, in a job, they'll walk into those doors and say, you know what, no matter what comes my way today, I'm going to remember that I am a child of God.
Thank you for listening to the Encounter Faith podcast. This podcast is a service of G. Shep Productions from Good Shepherd Lutheran Church in Naperville, Illinois. All rights reserved. If you're in the area, we'd love to meet you on a Sunday morning at our 9 a.m. or 10:45 services. At Good Shepherd, we are inviting everyone to walk together in the calling of Christ for a life of eternal impact. This podcast is produced and hosted by me, Ross Cochran. And our theme song is Wake the Earth by 1111 Worship. Thank you for listening. We'll talk again soon.